Killing in the name of killing in the name of those who die are justified by the uniforms they wear to do what they like. They justify those who die wearing uniforms to do what they like. Those who die are justified by the uniforms they wear to do what they like. Those who die are justified by wearing of uniforms to do what they like. They justify what they do, wearing uniforms they wear like they like. They justify those who die in the uniforms they wear to do what they like. Killing in the name of just do what law tells you. Only do what law tells you. Don't do what they tell you, because you only should do what law tells you. Judge Dredd scenario of General Vincent D. Dredd, General Advocate, Judgment of 2020. Our story begins after a long, difficult road for our poor Judge General Advocate D in the Judge Dredd scenario in the future USA of 2020 in its dystopic state in a pandemic. But before he got here, he went through training as a grunt undercover as the highest rank of all military on the planet. It led him to a special place at a duty station where he found himself holed up and reading the Uniform Code of Military Justice, written as a universal code of military justice, because he was being false witnessed and he wasn't alerted, but he knew it, and he wanted to look up exactly what was going on in the book to make sure he was obeying the Justice Code. Unfortunately, his read through the book of justice led to the enemies who were monitoring his thoughts, learning of the whole Code of Justice, as he had to read the whole Code of Justice to be a Judge General Advocate properly, the highest judge in all of existence, and to properly judge himself and those bringing him up for judgment. And as he defended himself and unraveled the plot of his enemies, he had to go through every penalty of the Book of Judgment of the Justice Code of the military that is uniform and universal. And he was being monitored by the enemies who were able to learn and immediately prove and uptake breaking every code of justice, leading to the need for the maximum penalty it could invoke, which was something not yet written, although it was known in the system of intelligence of the military. And it had a horrific path by way of genocide of the enemies, to extinction of the enemies, to the new punishment that the judge had not yet figured out. That ends up being the end of existence, of suffering itself, by way of the end of existence of those who refuse to live with suffering ceasing its existence. And in this story, being expressed as humans and their humanoid life forms they genetically altered and modified. Unfortunately, our judge in this Dredd situation, basically the last true police officer in existence, because he held all ranks in all uniformed forces and nearly everyone had turned corrupt, had to face down a police department that had been overrun by the enemy. That was massive. It was the largest county police department in the USA, basically in existence. And they were all imposters. because they had all committed so many crimes they no longer counted as police officers, but they all presented as police officers and ran the system in a corrupt, imposterish, fake way. So this led to him being false witnessed and deciding to try to peacefully write it out and prove his innocence. He was able to prove his innocence by first having to go through a sentence he shouldn't have that demanded the maximum torture possible within the justice code for everyone responsible for putting him through it. And as part of getting to proving his innocence, he was jailed a long time by a bunch of criminals running the penitentiary, supporting all the criminals in it, all with violence. So while they tried to murder him endlessly and they assaulted him regularly, this all came to a head when they tried to fake cell extract him when he had done nothing wrong, and they tried to go off the books to do it. And they tried to rape him, and they tried to murder him, and they brought down their meanest rape and murder killers, pretending to be police who might have once been police in their best gear. And our judge in this dread situation, Judge General D, killed them all. But he wasn't successful enough to keep that place dead like it needed to be, and it restocked rapidly. He defended himself, and he maintained his honor, and he slaughtered the enemy. And he was in no trouble, but he could not yet bring down the restitution needed of the infinite amount to be paid in wealth or currency, which can never be paid, and the infinite amount of penalties they had earned because of what they had done, systematically breaking every code at the maximum rate at that facility. This went on until nearly all of society was behaving this way. Judge D, the highest rank in all military, General D, found himself having run out of money to lead a normal life, only having enough to afford food, basically, and some meager possessions to live outdoors, which was better for him because he was growing back into his special giant form, and because the worst part of the corruption was having to live under a corporate thumb with the fake imposter police of the society constantly trying to murder and rape him and support the murder and rape ways of the corporations that at this point in the dystopic 2020 future during the pandemic were all fake being in business. We're all completely dead in business, and we're only in crime, while the whole society had died and all governments on the planet had died, and we're faking still being alive because the people in the positions that had died out refused to acknowledge it in the way the rest of society could know properly, while pushing them all to believe they had the rights to do anything they were able. They just wouldn't stop attacking Judge General Advocate D, living in public. And with him living in public, he had no cover or shelter, and they had taken up a horrific rate of maximum attack at all times. And this led Judge D to having to use his maximum weapon of infliction of destruction and death on them. While he did have minimal support of those who would make it, who do make it, who supported him, who helped him get to the weapon and set it up, they weren't doing so well at the first attack, and they were still honoring their vows to always obey the code of justice. So Judge D had weaponized some massive nuclear fuel rods. He was building atomic bombs with, nuclear bombs with, hydrogen bombs with, new types of nuclear bombs with, which they were moving away from using because they were far more powerful than completely annihilating only the Earth. They took the smallest chips they could off of them and added them to known and unknown nuclear facilities. It turns out that basically, at this point, the whole planet was built around a core of a nuclear facility with remote nuclear facilities attached in layers, while they had not been finished when they were stolen during the World War leading up to this point. And they were finishing the design with the fuel. They had finished preparing the weaponized fuel rods, nuclear fuel rods, and they were upgrading the facilities to use said fuel. It came a point when there was an opportunity in Beirut for the Judge General Advocate to run court, to run one of his cases. And he won the restitution so high, he took over the country Beirut was in and everything in it, with his first sight to try to control being Beirut. So he immediately moved on a nuclear facility in a port that they would not acknowledge, that had stolen a very powerful weapon of mass destruction from a communist country that was ready to destruct itself. His hand was forced to do this, so he upgraded the facility. He was trying to upgrade the facility's processing to work with its new fuel and bring his system online, which was mostly a self-destruct system, not necessarily to destroy the whole system, but to necessarily destroy everything that needed to be self-destructed, such as the enemies and nearly everything they had ever created in their image. They were basically nuclear isotopic elements that weren't exactly elements, pretending to really be elements, but never letting on they weren't elements, that couldn't handle the nuclear power, even the blast-powered nuclear power, like elements could, to lead a far better life, always having all the energy needed for all they ever needed morally. And unfortunately, these isotopic elements pretending to be things like humans and their pets and their bugs and their housing and their tools and their weapons and their cars and their technology were based on waste technology that was sort of like nuclear power, but not the same as the nuclear power the Judge General was using. That was a form of energy on its way to having its existence ceased. That has its existence ceased by the blast power of the true nuclear power the Judge General Advocate D had started enabling in the known and unknown nuclear facilities. So the judge set up the first self-destruct sequence, not enabling his full control of it. And then these fake isotopic element people used the function before it was fully enabled, while the judge and his support scientists and his other supporters and support teams were prepared for such a scenario and had prepared the failure to be of the smallest power type. Well, they blew up the weapon stolen there when it was attempting to be used, as the facility had been able to use it. And they used a blast function, not an explosion, a nuclear blast function with the new power capabilities of the weaponized nuclear material there. And the test went well. There weren't many casualties and fatalities. There was a 10-kilometer destruction zone. It wasn't enough. There was an airport at the edge that needed to be annihilated. Far more than everything at the center of the blast, which was annihilated well enough to achieve mission objectives. And the zone was set to regularly blast this way to control it, because they went wildly out of control in a mutant revolt of the isotopic element people who were pretending to be humans, who had no right, who were supposed to obey Judge General Advocate D, having won the whole country in court. But they immediately revolted, and the judge had about 2 minutes and 20 seconds to do all of this and flee back to DC. Well, the pandemic was caused by a horrendous virus, but the Judge General, Judge D, in the dread situation, had found a cure and treatment and inoculation. The problem was the isotopic people faking being humans refused to accept it because it was based on hemp. Instead, they wanted their DNA altered, and they had an option offered to them of tRNA pills. They became strange mutants of this constantly mutating DNA by their constant taking of tRNA pills, doing all the horrendous things people had always wanted this not to be done over. While they did achieve survival during the pandemic, they lost it and decided to try to look beautiful in horrendous ways, to try to have skills they couldn't exactly have, but they could have in ways they would die from. And the people who were doing this were basically the enemies of them, or using them against their enemies, having taken their enemies' people to make this of them. And they developmentally disabled them as part of the process of the DNA mutation by the tRNA pills they wouldn't stop taking. And these people had to lose most of their functions as human beings in order to live without guilt for what they had turned into. Constant weapons of attack with barely any, if any, self-awareness, basically no language skills, sort of running on automation that they might have a tiny amount of control of. They had also entered a state in time where computer chips in the brain were a real thing. It was sort of turning into a situation of them being plugged into a false reality, but it started out as an augmented reality system where they were sort of living in two worlds. One, where they were this terribly developmentally disabled thing, barely alive, but mostly living in a computer chip to not have to deal with the senses of their bodies, like the pain they were taking over their newly found skills by mutation their bodies hadn't leveled up to yet. And most of them would retreat into their chips to never return again, and to remote pilot their bodies right there in their bodies, in their chips, while also treating them like their bodies were never their property. They're some sort of collective communal property. And all these people really were at this point were weapons of constant maximum attack at the level that they would not snap people and each other to self-defense movements, especially the kill movements, that their system would push people to on snap. They had a great skill to not snap people without the snap being killing and self-defense, which they wouldn't push all the way to. And they would never stop torturing people. And they would never stop attacking. Well, this led to a better solution than the nuclear blasts and the nuclear bombs, when all the rest of life united to use permanent gassings to change all of existence. After our poor judge in the dread situation had judged everybody by being on a reconnaissance mission, living among them in public as he was, as it had turned out, it was what he was doing, even though it was against his choice in policy. He was able to judge the whole species in all of existence, so that the militaries supporting the code of justice of military that is universal and uniform were able to ethically, permanently gas all of existence and change it all, so these weapons of constant attack and everything in their image would no longer exist. And these were humans of non-parent creation and all such life that won this way. And it was a horrific act of suffering of the existence that ended as the first step, which is this tale of the dread judgment of Judge General Advocate General Vincent D., leading to an existence in which all suffering never exists. The end. They had the time of their lives, mutating to things they never were before. And it's true, they must never exist because of what they did to all they knew. And I swear we killed them all by what they do, and their existence will be something we never knew. They had the time of their lives, mutating to things they never were before. And it's true, they must never exist because of what they did to all they knew. And I swear we killed them all by what they do, and their existence will be something we never knew.